Welcome back. This is A RAP CRITIC. We are still here in the great state of Texas. And no, I ain't got drink in my cup. But this is video 2, which means we're going over category 2 of the classic 1989 album by the Geto Boys, Grip It, on that other level. And yeah, this is where we go over the rap performance on the album. And if you have not already, please take some time to like and subscribe to the channel. We're gonna jump right into it. Dimension 1 is personality and charisma. How much of that was conveyed on this album? Well, let's take a look at it, right? You get 3 very strong personalities on this album, 4 if you count DJ Ready Red. First, you got someone like Bushwick Bill, who comes from Brooklyn, ends up in Houston, and never makes a mention of it on the album. He doesn't mention Brooklyn or Houston the whole time. Mostly what he talks about is his size and how, yeah, he's acknowledging that he is a little person, but he's always aggressively challenging you to use that against him and see what happens, and reminding you that it doesn't limit him in any of the conventional ways, sometimes overcompensating, right? So that's his presence. Willie D, former boxer, Houston native, he is bringing Texas. If no one else brings Texas in an obvious way, Willie D is bringing it on this album. And I mean, he is shouting his lyrics and making declarations and bold statements that he's daring you to question him about. You're getting a lot of that on this album. And I do believe, I believe him and Scarface are both Scorpios, so I mean that might have something to do with it too. You're getting an aggression all throughout from Willie D. And then Scarface, you're getting aggression too, but you're getting more controlled, calculated aggression, where he's taking some time to plan his attack. And I think those 3 personalities all work together as one unified force of aggressive attack. A planned attack, you got a declarative attack, and you got a kind of inciting attack, like, yeah, I might start the fight kind of thing. And what's funny about this group is that they did not know each other beforehand. Bushwick Bill was the founding member, but Jay Prince put them all together, literally put them together to record it, and they were writing their rhymes sometimes separately, sometimes together, and just trying to create a group out of thin air. And I think it's very interesting that you do get some semblance of synergy on this album. You would think they were boys from the get-go. You know, there's a part at the end to do it like a Geto, where they go back and forth and then say lines in harmony or in unison, and it's like, oh, you know, you would thought these guys were together for a long time, but they were not. And so it's really interesting to consider the personalities and charisma that's exuded on this album. Shoot, this album bleeds personality and charisma. I think that is the dominant factor to it. But something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, which takes us to suspension of disbelief and believability. Now, we've established that this is the pioneering album for horrorcore hip hop. And so with horrorcore, there's always a suspension of disbelief disclaimer widely waved in front of everything, because anything else, it would fall into a statute of limitations that would really incriminate people. Like, this is premeditated murder on audio tape, right? So, you know, any rapper that engages in hardcore, the expectation is that you don't believe any of what's being said, that this is so macabre and exaggerated that it's just, you know, something to listen to. It's for shock and entertainment purposes. So because that's sprinkled throughout the album, and I do think that's kind of a cop-out that's been used over time. I don't think when they came out that they were saying, we're gonna make horrorcore hip-hop. I think they were just trying to be as extreme as they could be, and this is what came out of it. So the issue with an album where suspension of disbelief is being asked of you because of the horrorcore elements is that the other half of it is very much glued into who they're saying they are. So when Willie D is doing a song like Read My Nikes or a song like Ain't No Sellout, it's hard to distinguish from the other tracks because he's and the rest of the group are declaring that this is who they are. Bushwick Bill spends, like I said, almost 4.5 verses on his solo, telling you, this is directly tied to his size, and this is what he is about. So it's hard to be like, oh, he's just rapping it to rap. Scarface is probably the most in character on songs like Scarface because he's splicing, some of his real life with the movie elements of Scarface. He's actually taking scenes from the movie and, rhyming them in first person. Mind of a Lunatic, you find out later through, Scarface's own accounts of his life that, he's spent time in an asylum. He's, attempted suicide. And so Mind of a Lunatic, he's using pieces of that. So yeah, you're gonna have an interesting time trying to delineate which parts of this album are, just complete fiction and which parts of these are the life that these guys are living. And they're busy screaming it on every record that this is their real life and they're keeping it real and this is how it goes. Because then you get lines like when Willie D in the first song, Do It Like a Geto, talks about how the drug game goes and how black hustlers have to get their product from Hispanic dealers and they get ripped off, and he says, I never sold the junk myself. He said, I never did that, but if I did do it, I wouldn't have a middleman. I get all the money and keep it to myself. And so that's an honest sentiment. That's a statement, right? When they're talking about women, they talk about the things that they get tired of, the things they don't have time for, the times where they could have been played, but they turned it around. So it sounds very personal coming from lived experience. So when you get to songs where they're talking about, the darker stuff, it's like, when do I put this hat on and when do I take this hat off? So that's what I bring across to you. These three rappers have gone down in hip hop history. It's like G's, and Legends, The Street, and Real. And so it's just really interesting because I don't think it's easy for people to untie their perceptions from what was being done on this album, which is over the top shock value rap. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How much do you believe the Geto Boys on this album? And for the parts where you had to suspend your disbelief, how good of a job did they do at getting you to suspend your disbelief? I would think it wasn't that good of a job because it's so tied into the parts that are interpreted as real. It's just all, I can imagine for the time too, for shock rap to be new, for gangster rap to be new, most people will believe in these guys. Most people who didn't know any better. So that goes for the Karens in middle America and the young kids in the projects, listening to them as the new music. And it's like, oh, they do this. That's my theory. All right. Dimension 3, delivery and use of voice. So just like you get 3 distinct personalities, you get 3 distinct voices here. Now, Scarface's voice wasn't the voice that we've come to know, this gruff, kind of preacher tone where he's got this fatherly presence and he's, ominous. It was definitely more that rapid fire kind of style of the 80s with a lot of projection. They are all projection masters on this album. Willie D embodies projection. Every statement, like I said, is a bold declaration in that super southern Texas drawl. Sounds like your uncle or your daddy coming home with the belt, like you're in trouble. Almost the same presence that Samuel L. Jackson has in movies. He's using his voice as a boom, as a device to create miniature explosions every time he talks. He's saying every statement, as a declaration, as a notice for you. Bushwick Bill is doing it the same, but with so much enunciation. So without that Southern drawl and more enunciation than almost any rapper in the game at that point. Every word is so crystal clear when Bushwick Bill does it. It's almost like, man, you could have been a professor with this voice. Really interesting, but they're all pushing their vocals out on these tracks. There's no time for minced kind of musings on the mic. On the more mellow tracks, Scarface is the only one who takes advantage of that. So on Gangsta Love, he slows his cadence down, he plays with the tone a little bit, gets more rhythmic with how he lets the words land. And then on tracks like Scarface, he'll add character to the words. He was talking about a sex scene from the movie Scarface that he's living out, and a gunshot goes, and he goes something something, and his voice goes up to exaggerate the fact that he was caught off guard by a gunshot. He goes, "What? Somebody shot at me." I thought that was really interesting. So you can see that out of the three, Scarface had the most artistic flair because he's really playing around with his voice, and he uses his voice different ways due to different flows that he uses on the album. Out of all of the three here, Scarface plays with flows the most, and we'll talk about that as we go to the next dimension. But the declamatory statements and lots of projection and you know, where the beat is fast, sometimes slow is the way because you're making these boisterous kind of statements. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, how the voice was used and the delivery on this album. Takes us to dimension 4, the flow. Bushwick Bill and Scarface choose to use faster flows throughout this whole album. Willie D keeps that same slow, steady pace. So he's gonna breathe between each line. Here's a statement to proceed it. That's your couplet. Here's another statement. Here's another statement. They're all coming out with force. They're strong. It's a simple rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, A, B. No real deviation throughout the whole album from Willie D with that, but it fits. Then you get Bushwick Bill, who mostly, you know, he keeps the East Coast flavor by keeping up the pace and being that frenetic energy component to the group. When he comes in, the enunciation and the diction is super clear, but you know, he's putting syllables together at a pace that's maybe a step up from Willie D. He's still keeping a AB rhyme scheme, except for on, like I said, his solo Size Ain't Ish, where he loses some of that pace in the subsequent verses. So I think for verse 1 and 2, he stays in pocket, and then the verses after that, he loses place on the beat, and you can feel the beat trying to catch up to him because he's just kind of going and going. It feels like a freestyle that got turned into verses or squeezed in, or, you know, something got lost there. So he goes off beat and he's all over the place, and it just sounds like threats. It sounds like drunken threats after a while because it's off kilter. Then you get Scarface, who on track 1, rapping at the same pace as Bushwick and Willie D. Do it like a Geto. They're doing that 1980s flow. Like I said, lots of BPMs. So that kind of pace. And then you get a song after it like Gangsta Love, where, like I said, he slows it down, he slows the cadence down, and he's doing Willie D's kind of flow, just without the push. He goes mellow and smooth, even though he's saying just as harsh things as Willie D, but the breathing space is the same. He just chooses to use a mellow, smooth cadence to deliver his raps that follow this rhythmic bounce. You know. Then you get tracks like his solos, where that's where he speeds up the most, ironically. So Scarface, living in the fast lane, he does what is the foundation for the flow that we would come to know Scarface for. Scarface does these volley couplets where he'll go up for the first line and down for the rhyming line. So the Scarface that we've come to know, you know, I'll take a moment and I'm only great. It goes down. He was doing that in his own way. So we see those kind of rhymes on Scarface in Life in the Fast Lane. On Seek and Destroy, this is where it gets really interesting. On the first verse, he's using what you could argue is Rakim's flow, which you can argue even further that this was not a flow that wasn't being used by multiple rappers at the time. So it's hard to trace who started it. I know we credit Rakim for the multi-syllabalistic flow, but Scarface was easily doing that same style. And then on the second verse, dare I say, he was doing Big Daddy Kane's flow, where Big Daddy Kane was famous for putting whole rhyming lines together, but also stopping them at an interesting point in the bar line and then starting it again. So almost like haiku style. I rip them and rap it and temper the pepper to go. Pretending that, fronts, accounts, jumps, the teats, the plant, the brand, the rant, the dink, that kind of thing, right? So this rapid machine gun firing kind of flow that catches itself each time and then starts over again. It's almost like a typewriter. I know a lot of people have not seen a typewriter, but you would write until the bar ends and you'd have to start again. So first verse, a little different than the second verse. I would say it was Rakim style and then Big Daddy Kane style, but I don't know if it was a copy, because Scarface is very much an artist in his own right. And I think it was just a flex. I think he was showing, look, I can rap anyway. I can rap in all ways. I can do that East Coast stuff you're doing, and it's on a very East Coast sounding beat, very New York, Public Enemy, Bomb Squad sounding beat. And this is also the song that is the only straight rap song. He's talking about MCs. Everything he's saying is about being better than other rappers on the mic, and it has the least curses on the whole album. I don't even know if there's a curse word on it. It's talking about ripping the mic, ripping crews, and we'll talk about that when we go into the next dimension. But you get these pockets, and I think it's interesting to see how each rapper chooses their own flow, even though aggression is the tie that binds them all together, and their subject matter and the profanity, but they all chose to approach the beats in 3 different ways all throughout this album. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5, which is the wordplay and the bar intent. The bar intent we talked about when we were talking about Willie D's presence on the mic, very direct and deliberate. There's no beating around the bush. There's not a lot of time for clever poetic devices here. There's barely none. There's onomatopoeia from Willie D. When he's making it sound like a gunshot, he's wording and sounding it out. This is a gunshot. This is what I'm gonna do to you. Same thing from Bushwick Bill. You're not getting any clever rhetorical devices. You might get some alliteration. I feel like it might be accidental alliteration here and there. But Scarface, you are going to get some wordplay. On a very minute scale, you're gonna get things like alliteration, you're gonna get imagery, you're gonna get some similes here and there. Even Willie D uses similes. Bushwick Bill uses a lot of similes. These are very elementary similes, So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the wordplay and bar intent here, which takes us to dimension 6, punchlines, poetic wisdom, and overall quotability. Now, because these are 3 guys representing the South, if you want to count Bushwick Bill as representing the South, you're gonna get that little element of Southern talk that brings in things that are easy to quote. And then you're also getting a lot of profanity, which for a lot of people with that base sense of humor or, who gravitate towards that, it becomes entertaining to quote. If I'm saying I'm gonna do this to a woman, I'm gonna kick her out after I'm done with her, and you wanna live by that, it's easy to quote. Some of the things, even the titles of some of these songs have lived on in hip hop, legend. Let a hoe be a hoe. We've heard that be repeated throughout time, throughout decades now. So, for better or for worse, a lot of the songs on here and a lot of the statements that have been made on here have been quoted. And this was one of those lessons that I pointed out in one of the explainer videos for this channel, where I said, you know, part of why we do this is to go back in time and listen with new ears and realize that things aren't as old as the year or the time they make it seem. This is a 1989 album, and even I as a grown man was shocked to hear some of the themes and slang that was used and realized, oh man, I didn't know they were saying these kind of words back then. And I'm like, nothing really has changed. You know, behavior has been the behavior for a long time. The behavior of young men in the hood or young men in hip hop has been the same, and nothing under the sun is new. So yeah, you're not getting punchlines. Like I said, Scarface has not reached that point yet where he was dropping like this deep poetic wisdom. You get glimpses of that from both him and Willie D on songs like Do It Like a Geto and, you know, Sell Out. And even Bushwick makes some really poignant, memorable lines about being his height, being a little person, and how that doesn't mean anything. So words to live by in some ways. I would love to hear what you all think about the punchlines or the poetic wisdom or just the quotability, since we established that there really aren't punchlines on here. On a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, that is dimension 6, takes us to dimension 7. This is the idea of concepts. Are there concepts present on this album? Yeah, all throughout. If we're talking horrorcore, you're being asked to go into a conceptual space where, you know, Bushwick Bill is talking about a bank robbery gone wrong where he winds up wanting to take advantage of a woman but not, and killing people and cops, gunfights, blood fights, all of that stuff. Life in the fast lane. Scarface being an interpolation of that movie and Scarface's observations and this fictional tale that he wants to tell, blending those worlds together. I think that's probably the most conceptual here, because again, the content is pretty direct. On songs like Ain't No Sellout and Gangsta Love, they're not really concepts, it's just dealing with different subject matter. So yeah, I'd say Scarface is the most conceptual song on there besides Mind of a Lunatic. How well those were executed, I leave that up to you to rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that takes us to dimensions 8 and 9, which are your content externalized and your content internalized, right? And that's this idea that Geto Boys are talking about things both in and of themselves. You're not gonna get a lot of deep introspection, self-reflection, revelation of hard times, vulnerability, real life emotionality, but you will get their opinions on things. I keep mentioning No Sellout probably being the most focused song on here, where Willie D spends a lot of time talking about the Public Enemy controversy, how he feels like they were done wrong by media. He's standing up for them, he's standing in solidarity with them, and he's also standing up for freedom of speech and being able to say what they say. Bushwick Bill, on a couple songs, talks about, you know, how could his songs be worse than some songs that are out there. Most of you parents might curse worse than me, I doubt that. There's also mention of, you know, people taking their kids to see Schwarzenegger movies, that old argument that rappers love to make, that they're just like movies. Well, if that's the case, tell us that it's fiction. You guys don't do that. You guys say, this is it, this is me, this is who I am. You spend 12 songs saying this is real, going out your way to prove it. And so what you are getting is this externalized content to a high degree. From the beginning, talking about black radio or just rap radio, the bias that's going on, the bias, the racial bias, with what they were calling white-owned records versus being black-owned, and how it's harder to, you know, get far. There's limitations, but you have to work around them. And then, you know, when they're talking about women, they're talking about women in very, this is what people mean when they say misogyny. This is the definition of misogyny. There's not a point on this album where women are talked about any other way than as sexual disposable objects or scandalous creatures on the planet. So Let a Hoe Be a Hoe is only distinct from Gangsta Love because it is describing a certain kind of female that is not trustworthy, not worth investing real emotion into, and only good for sex. Whereas Gangsta Love, they're just saying things where it could be any woman. They're just saying, you know, they're not going to fall in love. This is how they have sex. It's going to be rough. And if you try to, you know, pin any responsibility on them from the sex, then, you know, they'll violently approach you. So you're getting domestic violence out the wazoo on these songs, and they're never acknowledging that part in any self-reflective way. And in the songs where there are more horrorcore themes, murder is unapologetic, there's no remorse. Bushwick Bill talks about rape on Mind of a Lunatic unapologetically. I think on his solo, he even goes into this this deep dive where it really gets meta, where he, you know, points out this whole scenario of how he can end up incarcerated for the things he's threatening to do in the song, but how he'll enjoy that, smoking with the warden. And I think he insinuates that he will rape one of the male inmates for cigarettes. I'll put the lines up here so you can decide for yourself. So, I mean, they're going super far on this album with externalized content. And the value of this content, is it valuable? You know, in the more enlightened moments, like Do It Like a Geto, where, you know, Scarface slips in the facts about black education disparities and just black histories, cool. Talking Loud, Saying Nothing, where they're calling out people who, you know, are boasting and bragging, people who lie, cool. Popular theme in hip hop. When we reviewed E40's album, we had a similar song on the track Bootsy. So really, there's content here, but the worth of that content is up for you to determine and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, which takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, storytelling. If there's nothing else, there's plenty of storytelling on this album. Scarface is storytelling, Life in the Fast Lane is storytelling, parts of Bushwick Bill's solo storytelling, parts of Willie D's solo storytelling. Mind of a Lunatic is a whole story. It's a precursor to My Mind's Playing Tricks on Me, but a much more aggressive precursor. My Mind's Playing Tricks on Me was a song where things were happening to the Geto Boys. Mind of a Lunatic is the Geto Boys happening to things. But there's storytelling elements all around. I don't know how gripping you feel like those stories are because they're so hyperbolic and they're so projected and shouted at you. And, you know, Scarface may grab you in. People who are familiar with the movie, I feel like you can picture that song as it's being told, as it's being narrated by Scarface. So I think he does a good job of playing off of familiarity and familiar elements. And you lose some of that when you get to Life in the Fast Lane, because that's more of, you know, just his storytelling from the street life without the movie part. But really something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How great was the storytelling on this album? That concludes our review of Grip It on That Other Level by the Texas legends, the Geto Boys. For better or for worse, I keep saying, introducing hardcore and shock rap and southern rap at the same time, putting Houston, Fifth Ward on the map, putting Scarface and Willie D on the map, and just upping Rap-A-Lot and Jay Prince's profile all together. And so I would love to hear your rankings and scores. I'd love to see your rankings and scores. DM me, email me. We're still building this global hip hop community, and we are not afraid to take it on the road. You know what it is. It's your boy Malik 16, and until next time, F a Rap Critic. Talk about it while I live it.